Welcome to the Arizona Author Series. This event was recorded on April 6, 2023. This Arizona Author Series is supported by the Arizona State Library Archives and Public Records, a division of the Secretary of State with federal funds from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. We are pleased to hear from Dr. LLoyd L, author of the book Diné Identity in a 21st Century World. LLoyd L, PhD, is an enrolled citizen of the Navajo Nation. He is Kiani, Towering House, born for Klaschehe, Red Cheeks. His maternal grandfather's clan is Ashii, Salt, and his paternal grandfather's clan is Tabaha, Water's Edge. He is professor and faculty graduate in the Department of Native American Studies at the University of New Mexico, director of the Center for Regional Studies at the University of New Mexico, and editor of the Wakaso Sa Review Journal. He sits on the Council for the American Indian Studies Association. He is the author of Diné Identity in a 21st Century World, Diné Masculinities, Conceptualizations and Reflections, co-author of Native Americans and the University of Mexico, and has edited Navajo Sovereignty, Understandings and Visions of the Diné People, and Diné Perspectives, Reclaiming and Revitalizing Navajo Thought. His research focuses on Native American identity, masculinities, leadership, philosophies, and Native nation building. We are pleased to hear from Dr. Lee and glad you can join us.
All right, thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation to share my book with the audience here. Welcome, everyone. I hope everyone is having a good day. I wanted to share with you a little bit about what the book is about and then talk about some of the identity markers that are in the book, and then to take your questions and comments on your thoughts in terms of what if you've read the book already or in terms of this presentation. So let me go ahead and share my screen here, and I have some slides that I'll show. Okay, so the title of the book is Diné Identity in a 21st Century World. It's actually partly based on my dissertation work when I was a grad student. My dissertation focused on Diné cultural identity among college students. Prior to going to graduate school, I was a social studies teacher at Fort Wingate High School, which is a Bureau of Indian Education school right outside of Gallup, New Mexico. And it's predominantly Native American students, mostly Navajo students, but there was also some students from Zacatone, Arizona, Tohono students. And so it was there that I began to notice the students and where they were coming from and what the type of cultural knowledge that they understood, and the history of their communities, of Native people in general. And so that got me thinking about, in terms of going back to graduate school, what would I be interested in focusing on in terms of my doctoral work? And so, so the dissertation focused on Diné cultural identity among college students and students in general. And so, so that's where this kind of comes from, that early experience. So let me go ahead and talk about what the book is focusing on. But before that, I want to kind of give you some context when it comes to the Navajo Nation and when it comes to enrollment and the criteria for enrollment and the differences when you look at identity in general. So if you look at Navajo enrollment, it's roughly a little over 400,000. The figure that you have here is from May of 2021, so it's a little over 400,000 now. So these are individuals that enroll with the Navajo Nation Vital Statistics Office. And I'll show you their criteria in terms of enrollment. Among that over 400,000, from the 2010 census, about 169,000 live on the Navajo reservation. The 2020 census shows that the number of individuals living on the Navajo reservation has gotten smaller. So the majority of Navajo people live off the reservation, but they live pretty close. Most of them live in Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and California. There are other people across the country, other Navajo people that live in other states across the country, and then as well as around the world. So when you look at the enrollment criteria, there are 6 areas. So when a baby is born and the parents want to enroll their baby into the Navajo Nation, they have to meet these criteria. So the first is, it states all persons of Navajo blood whose names appear on the official roll of the Navajo tribe maintained by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Second, any person who is at least 1/4 degree Navajo blood, but who has not previously been enrolled as a member of the tribe, is eligible for tribal membership and enrollment. Number 3, children born to any enrolled member of the Navajo tribe shall automatically become members of the Navajo tribe and shall be enrolled, provided they are at least 1/4 degree Navajo blood. So in these first 3 criteria, let me kind of give you some context there. So in about 1928, 1929, for the first time, the federal government began to do a register of Navajo individuals. So they began to go around to different communities to register individuals in that community, in that home, and so forth. Well, when they did that, it wasn't complete. And in fact, a lot of the names were written in English. And so many of the Navajo people's names were not in English. They were in the Diné language. So a lot of the names were shortened or changed to reflect communities and families in those communities. And so about 1940, they decided to do another register, or what would you call a census roll. And it was a little bit more thorough. And so the 1940 census roll is the official roll that the Navajo Nation and the Bureau of Indian Affairs uses when it comes to enrollment. So everyone that was registered and enrolled at that time, and all of their descendants, can enroll in the Navajo Nation. The other thing that the Navajo tribal government did was to follow the 1/4 degree Navajo blood. So even though there was a registration and enrollment in 1940, there was no official enrollment criteria in the Navajo Nation. That did not happen until 1953. In the early 1950s, the Navajo Nation government was trying to put together a constitution for their government. This was a second attempt at doing this, and actually a third attempt at doing this. And when they submitted the Constitution for approval by the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, it was rejected. Part of that Constitution included enrollment criteria. So they took that out separately after the Constitution was not approved. And they put it into a separate resolution, and it was the Navajo Council had a discussion on it. They approved the criteria and the process. And so this is what I'm sharing with you, is that criteria. So the 1/4 degree Navajo blood was discussed in the Navajo Tribal Council at the time. And they were trying to come up with a method that they could feel comfortable with. And so pretty much almost all tribes and native nations in the United States at that time was using blood quantum as a form of enrollment criteria. And so Navajo pretty much followed what everyone else was doing. Now, of course, the blood quantum criteria was introduced by the federal government. No indigenous community, no native community, the Navajo Nation included, did not have this as part of their cultural ways, as part of their history. And so this is the system that we have now, and it has not changed. The other component of this criteria is the lineal descent component, which is number 3, right? Children born to any enrolled member of the Navajo tribe shall automatically become members of the tribe, provided that they are 1/4 degree. So in reality, Navajo has two criteria here. You have to be 1/4 Navajo blood or more, and you have to be a descendant who's enrolled on the Navajo Nation in vital statistics. So it's pretty strict when you think about it in terms of their own. Almost all Native nations and tribes in the United States don't have that type of restriction. So they either do blood quantum only, or they do lineal descent. So there are very few that do both, and Navajo is one that does both. The other three components of the criteria are listed here. So number 4 says no tribal law or custom has ever existed or exists now by which anyone can ever become a Navajo, either by adoption or otherwise except by birth. Number 5, all those individuals who claim to be a member of the tribe by adoption are declared to be in no possible way an adopted or honorary member of the Navajo people. And then number 6, no person otherwise eligible for membership in the Navajo tribe may enroll as a member of said tribe, who at the same time is on the roll of any other tribe of Indians. So number 4 and number 5 had to do with the council being concerned about people who were claiming to be Navajo in the 1930s and 40s and previously. Many of those claims were by individuals who claimed that they were being adopted by the family. And so they're trying to prevent individuals from claiming that. So that's why they put that in the criteria. Number 6 is pretty standard across Indian country and with Native nations across the US. Basically, you can only enroll in one Native nation and not two. There are some exceptions today. In certain Native communities, they do allow you to enroll in another Native nation, but 99% of them do not. And so Navajo Nation is one of them. So I wanted to share this with you as to give you some context. So when people think about identity, when they think about Native peoples, one of the things they think about is enrollment. And what is the criteria of that particular Native nation. So for Navajo, this is what it is. Since 1953, there really been only a couple of times where the council has thought about and amending this criteria. Once was in the early 2000s. There was an attempt to change the blood quantum level from 1/4 to 1/8. That did not go anywhere in the Navajo Council. And then a few years ago, there was an attempt in the committee to make some changes to the enrollment criteria to try to bring in more lineal descent into this, and then as well as land knowledge. That also did not go anywhere in the council. So there's been no changes since 1953 in terms of this particular enrollment criteria. That's not to say that there won't be in the future. But, you know, when I was doing my research on that dissertation, and then more recently, just talking to people about Diné identity and Navajo-ness and so forth, pretty much majority of Navajo people are very comfortable with this enrollment criteria. They don't see any need to change what's here. You know, when you're either the largest or second largest Native nation in the United States, I can see why that they feel comfortable not making any amendments or changes. You know, kind of fluctuates between Navajo Nation and Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, which is the largest Native nation in the US. So let me share what's in the book, knowing this particular context. So the book focuses on specific markers, and these markers have been a part of the Navajo way of life and for Navajo people since the very beginning, and they still are very much part of the way of life today. These are not things, these markers are not exercised, they're not forgotten, they're very much part of the way of life today and of Navajo people's thoughts. But what I'm sharing with you basically none of this is in that enrollment criteria. So if you look at that, go back to that enrollment criteria, none of these markers are there. So the first marker has to do with history and cultural knowledge. So Navajo people have a creation scripture. They have journey narratives that talk about their origin and their history. Navajo is one of the few Native nations that has had their journey creation scripture and part of their journey narratives written down in English. Most Native nations do not have that written in English. It's predominantly mostly still oral tradition in terms of that. But Navajo is one of the few that has written it in English. Really, the first individual to do that was Dr. Washington Matthews back in the 1880s when he spent some time on the Navajo reservation. He talked to different medicine men at the time and had translators at the time, and he began to sort of document parts of these narratives, and then eventually put together a manuscript in the 1890s called, he would title it Navajo Legends. But really, a lot of those narratives are not seen as legends or myths among Navajo people. But nonetheless, that's sort of the earliest first written documentation in English of the Navajo creation scripture and journey narrative. So those narratives are the foundation of this particular first marker. But also that adds to that is the experiences of Navajo people with American and settler colonialism, that history of the last 300 years, what their experiences were with Europeans, with the Spanish, then Mexican, and then Americans. And so all of those experiences, all of the positive and negative, the trauma, the violence, all of that is part of this history, part of this cultural knowledge. And it continues to this day. So this is a living marker. This is not something that's just stagnant in the past. It's very much part of our lives today. So when you interact with Navajo people, when you interact with their families, they have their family stories, their family narratives, their experiences in where they live, whether it's on the reservation or off the reservation. All of that is part of this history and cultural knowledge. You also have knowledge about herbs and plants and medicines, songs, prayers, ceremonial songs. All of that is part of this particular marker. You also have the experiences regarding farming, the growing of crops like corn, certain types of vegetables. You have hunting in certain mountains and certain ranges, hunting of deer and so forth. Sheep herding, right? That became one of the major economic systems of Navajo people for such a long time. It still continues to this day. You have ranching, right? You have Navajo families and individuals that have ranches that take care of livestock like cattle and sheep and horses and so forth. So all of those aspects and elements of a way of life are part of the history, are part of the cultural knowledge. And so this is very much still ongoing, it's still alive, and it's pretty much in every Diné person, every Navajo person. The second marker is thought, or a term that I like to use that I borrowed from Apache philosopher Viola Cordova. She uses the term matrix to talk about Native philosophies and to talk about Native worldviews. And so I appreciate that term. I think it's an appropriate term to talk about not only Navajo thought, but any indigenous or Native thought. And so when you look at this marker, what we're focusing on is a way of thinking, it's a way of knowing, it's a way of understanding. It's also, it develops a path of life for individuals. So these individuals learn what their purpose is in life and what they need to do and their roles and responsibilities that come along with that. Now, the backbone of this marker is Sa'ana Wan, which is a phrase that you hear predominantly in our songs, our ceremonial songs, our prayers. It's a phrase that you really don't say just openly, just sort of nonchalant type of just pronunciation of it. Because it's a sacred and respected way of understanding about what life is about and how you're to live. So it's the backbone of this marker. So in a Navajo matrix, this concept, this way of thinking, it creates a foundational principle of the universe. So it exemplifies values, beliefs. It represents an animated and living journey. It's also shows our world as a static and active dimension. It's in human beings. It's also considered speech and thought, and it's also brings in the male and female aspects of living. And so when we think about thought and matrix, we're trying to understand what this means for us individually in our lives, but also in a group, a system, or a community. Or an extended family network, something along those lines, to kind of understand what that phrase relates to in terms of the individual and their connection to their family and to their community and to their nation. Along within this thought and matrix is also an understanding of planning and learning. If you've ever looked at Diné College and their vision and mission, they talk about the foundational learning process that they follow, right? And so everything at Diné College is about this Diné learning process. So in this learning process, there are four thoughts, right? Four ways of living. And so they are in Sahak-es, which is thinking, Nahat-a, which is planning, Inna, which is living, and then Sihasin, which is reflection. So this framework is how you learn, how you understand, how you do things in life as a human being, how you do things as a Navajo person. And so all of this encompasses this particular marker. Now, I also want to mention that this marker, when we look at thought and matrix, it's supposed to be done in the Diné language. However, because English is so much part of our way of life now, English has to be a part of this marker because of not only our own education in the school system, but in terms of just communicating with each other and communicating with non-Navajo people. So this encompasses that as well. So it encompasses the language itself and then English. So the third marker is specifically on the language itself, right? So when you think about the Diné language, you're thinking, you're speaking, you're saying a prayer, you're singing a song, you're conversing with other Diné people in the language. You may be telling a narrative, or you may be telling a joke, right? And so all of this encompasses this marker of language, and the way of talking in the Navajo language follows a specific protocol. So that specific protocol is to talk in the language in a positive way. So everything that you say, everything that you communicate with people is supposed to be positive. It's supposed to be in a good way. It's supposed to be respectful of the person, respectful of the experience, respectful of the particular space that you're talking in. So you're really careful in terms of having those types of discussions, those types of conversations, and using the appropriate words. And so course, now, a lot of that has been impacted by settler colonialism, by the history of interactions with the Navajo people, with the Spanish, Mexicans, and then Americans. And so there has been a shift, right? And that language shift is to English. And so when you look at the statistics now, majority of Navajo children speak English only. They're not learning the language. But there are efforts now that are making sure to maintain the language and to revitalize it, right? And so, so for instance, you have examples of using schooling and education as a way to help maintain and revitalize the language. So you have the Seheso Diné Identity school that has an immersion program for elementary kids. You have Western modes of teaching the language, right? Like the Rosetta Stone software. You have apps that are being created by Navajos to teach the language, to teach words. And then you have language nests being developed. The Se La language nests in Albuquerque, New Mexico, right? They just started that process here, where the family is involved in learning the language and helping to teach the language to their babies and to their children and so forth. So there are many efforts taking place on Navajo Nation, off Navajo Nation, to maintain and revitalize the language. So, this is going to take a while, right, in terms of the efforts of this and the success of this. But right now, this is taking place now, and the language is part of these markers of Diné identity. The fourth marker is relations. And there's two elements of this. So the first element is K, which is the acknowledgement between biological related and clan related family. So Navajo Nation follows a clanship system. And this clanship system is based on your mother, your father, your maternal grandfather, your paternal grandfather, and the extended family network. And so it's very common to hear Diné people, when they introduce themselves or when they interact with other Navajo people, they will say their clans, right? And so, so that K element is your clans, but it's also your biological family. It's also your clan-related family. It's also your extended family network. So it's really understanding your relations in a positive way, and acknowledging and respecting your relatives. So, in the past, when other Diné people interacted with each other, they would introduce themselves, talk about their clans, where they're from, their family, and so forth. And so based on that, then you would know how to appropriately address them, how to be respectful of them. And so, so in many cases, you use the appropriate term in the language to do that. So for example, for me, my clan, my mother's clan is my clan, and we're Kia'ani. So any female person I meet that is Kia'ani, they are my mother. And so that's how we related. That's the appropriate way to address them. Just like if any male person I meet that's Kia'ani, they may be my uncle or my brother, just depending on the age difference and so forth. So that element is a part of this marker of relations. The other element is K, which is connection to humans and non-human entities such as animals, birds, mountains, rivers, lakes, hills, stars, etc. So basically what this means is that you as a human being are connected to other non-human entities. These could be animals, they could be birds, they could be the mountains, they could be the sun, they could be the moon, it could be the stars, the universes, the galaxies, the water, the rivers, the lakes, and so forth. So based on that understanding of your connection to non-human entities, then you see them as part of your relatives. You see them as part of your family. And so therefore, you're going to respect them. You're going to make sure that you follow a reciprocal relationship. So that's very important. It also helps you to understand your role and responsibility, both in terms of, let's say, your clans, your related clans, and then to the mountain and to the lake, and to the river. So those roles and responsibilities are understood with this way of this particular marker. So Navajo also follows extended family networks. That's been always part of their history, always part of their way of life. And so when you think about a Navajo family, you're not just thinking about your biological family, the biological nuclear unit, you're thinking a much larger network. So this could be your grandparents, your aunts, your uncles, your cousins, and so forth. And so when you hear Navajo people talk about, this is my grandmother, this is my grandmother, and all these other people are your grandmother, you can see that based on this element of relations, that's the way that Navajo sees that, and that's how we are connected to each other, both in terms of biologically, clan related, extended family and networks, and then also to other human beings, to other human groups around the world, and to the natural environment, and to the earth. So that's what this marker focuses on. The fifth marker that I talk about in the book is land. So the narratives that are in families and individuals tie experiences and observations of specific spaces and places on the land. Energies, entities, phenomenon that are tied to the living, migrating, hunting, farming, praying, all of those narratives that are tied to the land and our connections to that land. So this particular marker is about creating a sense of belonging. It also really kind of engages both the political, social, and cultural power of the people that are that are connected to the land itself. So when we think about the land, it's not just necessarily the reservation as you would think about it today. It includes that, but it's not necessarily just exclusive to that. It also includes other areas that Navajo people congregate, that Navajo people live. And so Ho-Chunk scholar Renya Ramirez coined the term native hubs to talk about contemporary or present day mechanisms of these gatherings of Native people to support one another, to support a way of life, a community, an identity, and a sense of belonging. So when you think about Navajo, you think about the Navajo Nation itself, but also you think about all of the Navajo communities that are in Phoenix, that are in Albuquerque, that are in Salt Lake City, that are in Denver, these urban environments. There are large numbers of Navajos in those places. So those are spaces that create this sense of belonging, these native hubs. And so when we think about the land, we have to think about it in terms of what is the reservation encompassing today, but also these other places that are outside of the reservation. So these are the 5 primary markers of Diné identity. And let me go ahead and conclude with some final thoughts about this. So when you look at the history of the Navajo Nation and you see a lot of forced integration and colonization in that history, what you also see is the strength of Diné identity, Navajo identity. It continues to this day. And all of these markers are exercised by individuals, by communities on a daily basis, right? You see this constantly. It hasn't ended. I don't believe it's ever going away. I think a lot of Diné people, a lot of Navajo people, really are proud of their people and their way of life, and so they're going to continue to make sure that it's alive, right? So you definitely see that. The other concluding remark is that these markers lead to maturation as a human being and Navajo and Diné person. So the purpose of life from a Diné point of view, and I think for many other indigenous and native communities' point of view, is that life is about maturation. It's about understanding your role and responsibility as a human being and your native community. So you go through stages of life. So you start off as a baby, you learn who your family is, you learn who your relatives are, you learned what your purpose is in being a part of that family. You learn how to love, you learn who the relatives are, the appropriate terms. And then you go, and then you become a young child, and then you reach puberty, and then you transition into a young man, a young woman, and so forth. And you learn a little bit more. You learn a little bit more of the culture. You learn a little bit more of the way of life. You learn about songs and stories and prayers. And then you become an adult, and then you have your own family, your own children, and then you become an elder. So these life stages, you are leading towards maturation. You're learning more about your histories. You're learning more about your families. You're learning more about the Diné way of life. And so these markers help you in that process. Now, one of the things that I want to really emphasize, and I do this in the book as well, is that these markers do not declare an authentic Navajo person, but rather provide a pathway for each person. So what that means is that, when you look at Native identity, when you look at Indigenous identity here in North America and the US and Canada, there's really, it's gotten to the point where we are declaring certain things as authentic Indigenous or authentic Native. And that's really something that kind of follows sort of this binary paradigm of thought, which is to say that you're either authentic or inauthentic. You're either traditional or you're contemporary. You're either full blood or mixed blood. You kind of, we fall into that trap of thinking of life as either or. When you look at Diné thought, when you look at Diné matrix, when you look at other Native communities, their thought and matrices, it was never either or. It's always the both and paradigm. It's about the connections that you have to your family, to the community, to other peoples, to non-human entities. And so all of this knowledge, all of these markers are designed to help you follow a pathway of life that's appropriate for you. And rather than sort of saying, okay, if you don't follow this pathway, then you're not Diné or you're not Native. And that's really not necessarily what the book is about. It's not about trying to kind of put it in that fashion. It's just trying to show you, okay, for Diné people, for the Navajo Nation, this is a pathway that they've developed to understand who they are. And then the fourth aspect of this conclusion is Diné identity is really about supporting and strengthening a distinct group and way of life. So these markers on land and relations and language and thought and matrix and history and cultural knowledge, all of these markers are there to support and strengthen the Diné people, their way of life, to maintain it, to revitalize it. And if some things have been forgotten or lost, possibly regenerate that knowledge, regenerate that tradition, regenerate that way of life. And so that's what the book is really about, to kind of highlight those things, and really emphasize that point, in a positive way, and really shows the strength of the people, and the resiliency of their way of life and what they've gone through. And so I really wanted to emphasize that point with this particular book. I mean, there's a lot more that could be a part of the book, in the sense of, comprehensive information, but it wasn't I didn't necessarily design it in that way to do it like that. It was more just trying to emphasize the different markers of Diné identity, and how they're maintained and how they continue and are very much part of people's lives today. Okay, so I'll go ahead and stop there, and share any comments or thoughts or questions that you might have.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks so much. So the first question we have is, does the Navajo Nation tend to preserve tribal history and cultural knowledge today in written form, or is oral tradition still used as the appropriate preservation mechanism?
I think what we're seeing today is that we're utilizing both still. We're utilizing the oral tradition, but we're also utilizing the written language. And so you're starting to see more and more Navajo people go to college and get their college degrees and their higher degrees, like master's and doctoral degrees. And they are beginning to write and document the histories, the challenges that Navajo people are facing. And so you have that, and it's growing. And then you still also have the oral tradition, which is sharing of narratives, sharing of knowledge, amongst family, amongst people when we gather, for a variety of different reasons, whether it's a ceremony, or it's a birthday party, or it's a kinlota, right, which is a girl's puberty ceremony. Whatever it may be, in those types of gatherings, there's the sharing of that type of information with each other. So you still have that. It's not documented, it's not recorded, although you do see some recordings of some oral history. Diné College has done some of that, and I think some Navajo scholars have done some of that too as well. So you do have that.
Wonderful. Um, Another question, what are some of the challenges carrying on a Navajo identity that has been through intergenerational traumas related to family, language, health, and so on? Is there healing deviating from the colonial paradigm?
Well, I think when you look at individual families, I think you will find different experiences when it comes to that. So there'll be families that will really try to create or follow a wellness plan, to bring back the ceremonies, to bring back the prayers, to help individuals deal with the trauma, in a Diné way. And then you have others who also utilize the Western ways, in terms of hospital care, in terms of public safety and law enforcement, to protect individuals from the trauma if they're dealing with other individuals. So you see both taking place, and it varies with each family. I think with each individual, what their preference is and what they're comfortable with. Um, but I know that I've seen it. The Navajo Nation government has developed some wellness programming as well when it comes to physical health, their emotional, mental, and psychological health as well. One of the ways that the government has done this is through in the judicial system on Navajo. They have a peacemaking branch of that system. So basically, if there's a case that comes up in Navajo tribal court, and it's maybe a domestic case or something like that, or whatever it may be, they may ask the individuals involved if they would like to go a peacemaking process, which is to Navajo is one of the few Native nations that have sort of formalized the peacemaking process. So they know very well what takes place within that system, in terms of the judges on Navajo and people who work in the justice system. They have peacemakers that they hire and people who are trained to do this. And basically, peacemaking is really about conversation. It's about talking out the challenge, the issue, and trying to create a positive outcome from that. And everyone is involved. It's not just one person. It's not just one individual, but everyone. And these includes the families. They want everyone involved. It's about trying to create healing from that, or to begin the healing process. So you have examples of that take place within, in the Navajo government system, but you also have it predominantly mostly with families and the approaches that they want to take.
Wonderful. And I have another question from another attendee. Would you consider these markers to be a complement to the peoplehood matrix? In other words, if they were to be taught in American Indian studies or other audiences, would it be appropriate to use a graphic that displays both and where they fit? And maybe just for folks who don't know, maybe you could kind of explain a little bit more, maybe some of the differences.
Well, the peoplehood model was a model that was created by Tom Home and others at the University of Arizona, and it talks about how sort of it. I think the academic world says it's a theory, but it's not really a theory. It's really a framework of understanding, Native people, and there are 4 elements of Native people, right? That's in that model. So you have the history, the sacred history. You have identity. You have whoops, sorry. I don't know if you heard that beep.
I didn't.
Oh, okay, then I guess not. You have land, and you have ceremonies. So these are sort of the 4 factors, 4 elements that represent who Indigenous peoples are, and so you have language, you have the land, you have the history and religion. I think it would be an interesting way to kind of, as a teaching moment, to kind of look at both and kind of compare and contrast both in that way. I've never done that, but it might be an interesting way to teach something like that. The peoplehood model is it's a model that's supposed to be applicable to all Native nations, to all Native peoples. That when you talk about Native peoples and you look at their ways, you look at their history, You look at any aspect of them, right? There's these elements of language, sacred history, land, ceremonies, spirituality, and stuff like that. And then I think I think that would be an interesting way to have a teaching moment like that. But I've never done that myself. Um, but yeah, maybe I'll look into that.
Yeah, that definitely sounds like it'd be interesting, especially if students are already engaged in that discussion of that model. Yeah. And I have a question as well. This book is as informative as it is personal, which is never an easy balance to strike. Could you maybe talk about your writing process a little bit, how that was for you and how you put it all together?
Okay, sure. Well, my writing process has really kind of um, gone through a lot, I say, in the last 20 plus years. When I was a student, a college student, even graduate school, writing was pretty intense for me. It was hard. It was hard to write. Um, but as the years have gone along and learning from different people, getting their experiences in reading and sort of began to do research and write articles and put together books. It's changed and evolved to the point where, um, for me, I've sort of developed a process where I feel comfortable with. So the first process is really, and this is something that when I was a college student, I always felt was important, was to answer a question. And the question is this appropriate to write about? Is this something that my family, my relatives, Native people would be interested in reading and understanding? Is it appropriate to talk about these issues in the written format? So I sort of developed that when I was a student because I was taking courses and got me thinking about these things that I was learning regarding Native histories. And so since that time, I really sort of tried to follow that. And so a lot of the when I first started in the academy, um, I said I was going to do a 4-part project on Navajo specifically. Um, and the idea was to focus on our philosophy, our thought, um, our land, our identity, and our sovereignty, because these are things that you hear about a lot, not only on Navajo, but among other Native communities. And so I was going to get this done at some point, and I'm getting there. It's almost done. There's actually I'm right now going through the copy edits of the land, which is the last one. When you mentioned the books, the Diné Perspectives was the first one on thought and philosophy, and the sovereignty, Navajo sovereignty one was on sovereignty, and then this one, Diné Identity, is on identity itself, and then the last one is on land. So actually, it's supposed to come out later on this fall from University of Arizona Press. I'll tout that. But yeah, and so in that sense, that question has sort of been driving me in terms of my writing process. So when I decide to focus on a particular theme or a particular topic or issue, I try to look at that first question. And if the answer is yes, this is appropriate, this is something that people are going to be interested in reading about and trying to understand about, then I began to kind of do a little research on that area, on that topic, on that theme, and what I've learned from others and talking to other people, trying to gather as much information as possible. And then I put together a little outline, in terms of what I think, what should be talked about. And then I I think more recently I've started to write the conclusion first, and to say, and my reading has also kind of followed that too, is that when I read a book or when I read an article, I read the conclusion first. And then I read an introduction, and then, I can read the rest of the body of the article. But it's kind of, for me, it's kind of good to kind of know, well, answering that question that everyone asks in the academy, so what, so I kind of write the conclusion, and then I write the introduction, and then I write the rest of the body to kind of fit that in that way. But that was not the process when I first started, but now I realize now that's sort of the way I do. I usually write in the mornings. I can't write late at night. I'm not Vine Deloria. Vine Deloria used to write things, late at night into the early morning. I need to get some sleep. So I usually do better in the morning. So I'll write in the mornings, and I try, just depending on where I'm coming from and what the focus in is, I might really kind of try to do this in a short amount of time. So maybe a couple of weeks, doing it every day for a couple of weeks. But sometimes it's good to kind of stop and take a break from it and come back to it later. And so I've done some of that as well with some of my writing. But I notice now that it's, putting together an outline, starting off with the conclusion, writing in the mornings, and trying to do it for a short period of time, not too long. I don't think I could do, beyond 2 weeks. I know some people that like to write every day, and that's amazing to me, but I'm quite not there yet. I only can do it for a short period of time, and I have to take a break and come back to it later. So yeah, just depending on what it is. If it's an article, you could probably get it done in a month or two. If it's a book, it's much longer than that. So
Well, that's wonderful. I mean, I've never written a book, so that it always amazes me when people actually do it and they're actually able to produce that, because it's incredible. Okay, so we don't have any other questions from the audience. So I'm just going to share a screen really quickly one more time. And I just want to thank everybody for attending today, and to thank you, Dr. Lee, for presenting. It's been really interesting, and we really appreciate your time. On the screen and in the chat is a link to a survey. If you could please fill it out. It's just a few quick questions, and it just helps us with our future events. So thank you again, everybody, and have a wonderful day.
thank you.